So this morning I'm going to start off with a really bad joke, and I figure we can just go uphill from there. So here it goes. God told Moses, "Take off your shoes, Moses, and approach the burning bush." And Moses did and burnt his feet. And God said, "Ha, third one today." So let's move on from there. Okay, this morning we continue our study of Exodus, which derives from the Latin word meaning exit or departure. And in the context of this story, it holds the meaning of being liberated from bondage. As we recall from last week's scripture, Moses' life was saved because of some amazing, courageous women. This being only the beginning of the Exodus narrative. But before we get into this morning's scripture, we need to get caught up on what's been happening. First, there is the birth and dangerous rescue of Moses from the context of Egyptian slavery. Then Moses is raised by the Pharaoh's daughter in the Pharaoh's house, but cared for by his Hebrew mother, which Moses knew nothing about. Then as a young man, he witnesses the beating of a Hebrew slave by an Egyptian. Risking everything, Moses intervenes and kills the perpetrator, becoming a fugitive. Moses' compassion and courage, not unlike the midwives and other women from the beginning of this Exodus story, begin to shape the man of God he will live into. In chapter 3, we find Moses in exile. His exile being the direct result of his questioning of the abuse of his people. Moses has now started a new life, a new family, and is making his living as a shepherd for his Midianite father-in-law in the land of Midian, in the shadow of Mount Horeb, in the mountain of God, also known as Sinai. So Moses is way out beyond the wilderness by the mountain of God. He's out there minding his own business and taking care of a flock of sheep, when all of a sudden he comes across this burning bush. Amazed by the fact that this bush is burning up, but at the same time it's not being consumed by the fire. Could this be a mirage? I mean, it must have been pretty hot out there. Maybe his eyes were playing a trick on him. He moved closer to inspect the bush, as his curiosity moved him to try to figure out why the bush is not burned up. But Moses' inspection is stopped quickly when God gets Moses' attention by calling out his name. Moses answers, "Here I am." God then tells him not to come any closer and to remove his sandals from his feet, as the place on which he is standing is holy ground. God tells him who he is. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And God starts telling Moses all about observing the misery of God's people who are in Egypt, that God has heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. God explains further that knowing the Israelites' sufferings has led God to come and deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land of milk and honey. J. Gerald Jansen writes that a biblical faith tells the story with the conviction that every cry with the individual throb of suffering it expresses is falling, cry for cry, not on deaf ears, but on the heart of God. If God is hidden, God is hidden within the suffering. And we might even examine a bit closer in our own world today that idea of God is hidden within the suffering, but more on that later. Now we get down to the nitty-gritty, which I'm sure Moses had to be curious about. I mean, here's this burning bush, and God is talking to him. So Moses had to be wondering, what does this have to do with me? And God says, "I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" You know, it's not too sure that God's picked the right person for this job. God said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. Without the curiosity of Moses from his encounter with the holy, without a spirit willing to explore, wonder, and be open to what he was unable to understand, there probably would be no voice calling out to him. The questioning, the curiosity, and the sacred place in which he encounters the holy voice of God all go hand in hand. What's more, the curiosity and the experience of holiness are inseparable from what comes next. The call of God for Moses to be God's agent of justice and liberation for the people. It may have seemed to the Hebrews that God had moved on, just as Moses had sought to move on, leaving the agony of the Israelites behind. However, God was listening to the cry of their oppression. When this questioning, curiosity-driven son of Pharaoh's daughter shows up, God calls upon Moses to speak out on behalf of justice. Holy curiosity that leads one in the ways of God is necessarily accompanied by the type of humility that removes one's sandals on holy ground, and also humility which acknowledges one's own weakness and limitations. It should come as no surprise that Moses humbly responds with an apprehension at this justice liberation call. According to this week's text, Moses hears from God a word that is spoken to all whose curiosity brings them to holy ground, and the call to be agents of justice. I will be with you. I'm sure God has been hearing the cries and suffering of God's people from the empires of today, the cries from the borders, from women and children, from indigenous people, from the LGBTQ community, from people of color. I wonder, does it have to be a burning bush to get our attention to hear God's call? Or might we examine a bit closer in our own world today the idea that God is hidden within the suffering? On June 28th, in 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village neighborhood of Manhattan, New York City, a police raid began a series of spontaneous violent demonstrations known as the Stonewall Riots. Children of God stood up against the continued violence of the LGBTQ community. Take your shoes off. This is holy ground. And people heard God's call as those riots started one of the most important events leading to the gay liberation movement and the fight for LGBTQ rights in the United States. A year after the uprising, to mark the anniversary on June 28, 1970, the first gay pride marches took place in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The anniversary of the riots was also commemorated in Chicago, and similar marches were organized in other cities. Within a few years, gay rights organizations were founded across the US and the world. The Stonewall National Monument was established at the site in 2016. In 1973, Lambda Legal became the first legal organization established to fight for the equal rights of gays and lesbians. And in the same year, the American Psychiatric Association removes homosexuality from its list of mental disorders in the Manual of Mental Disorders. In 1995, the Hate Crime Sentencing Enhancement Act goes into effect. And in 2009, Obama signs the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act into law. In 2012, the Democratic Party becomes the first major US political party in history to publicly support same-sex marriage on a national platform at the Democratic National Convention. In 2015, the US Supreme Court struck down all state bans on same-sex marriage and legalized it in all 50 states. In 2019, Billy Porter became the first openly gay Black man to win the Emmy for the Best Lead Actor in a Drama Series. And in 2020, the Supreme Court rules that federal law protects LGBTQ workers from discrimination. This landmark ruling extends protections to millions of workers nationwide. There is still so much more to do, but hearing the call is the first step. On February 14, 2018, at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, 17 children of God were killed and more were injured. And the people heard God say, "Take your shoes off. This is holy ground." God's call was heard, and a movement began by the youth of the Stoneman Douglas High School to make changes in our current gun laws. They began the March for Our Lives March, and there were some changes to gun laws in some states, like raising the age limit for buying guns to 21, criminal background checks, and some states banned bump stocks, which have been used in massive shootings. And 11 states passed laws in 2018 that restrict gun access to people linked to domestic violence. And 8 states, plus the District of Columbia, created ways to temporarily keep guns from dangerous or at-risk people. There is still so much more to be done, but hearing the call is our first step. In December of 2018, at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Katowice, Poland, and again in September 2019, at the United Nations Climate Action Summit in New York, New York, a child of God spoke. Greta Thunberg heard the call of action toward our earth, our air, our water, our land. She heard God say, "Take your shoes off. This world is holy ground." Through the voice of this young woman, a movement towards climate change was heard. And there is still so very much more for us to do. But of course, hearing the call is our first step. On May 25th, 2020, at 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, Minnesota, there under the knee of police officer Derek Chauvin was a child of God. And soon after, the world heard God's call, loud and clear, as George Floyd released his last breath. Take your shoes off. This is holy ground. God's call was heard and people came. They came by the thousands to make known that Black lives matter and that justice needs to be done, that God's children must be cared for, that laws and structures must change so that the equality for all may be truly lived out. There may not have been an actual burning bush, but there definitely was a call from God to God's people to do something, and they did. They protested with one message: Black lives matter. People protested in all 50 states and in 50 countries around the world. The police officers who were involved in the death of George Floyd have been charged, and some other race-related police shootings are being investigated. In the United States and in the United Kingdom, statues and monuments of people with links to slavery have been taken down. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi ordered the portraits of 4 former House speakers who served in the Confederacy removed from the U.S. Capitol. Pelosi told reporters the removal of the portraits on Juneteenth, coincided with the day in 1965 when enslaved people in Texas learned of their freedom 2 years after the emancipation. Many of the world's biggest brands have pledged their support for Black Lives Matter movement. In some states, police departments are making changes such as banning chokeholds and neck restraints and no-knock warrants. Trump signed an executive order on police reform, which calls for higher professional standards, training on de-escalation techniques, and use of force. It also establishes co-respondent services, a system in which officers would pair with social workers when responding to nonviolent calls. Unfortunately, the order does not address the link between racism and police brutality. Some programs have been taken off streaming platforms that contain racially insensitive or inappropriate characters. NASA renamed its Washington, D.C. headquarters after Mary W. Jackson, the space agency's first Black aerospace engineer and mathematician. Quaker Oats announced it was retiring its Aunt Jemima brand of pancake mixes and syrups after 131 years. The manufacturers of Uncle Ben's rice, cream of wheat porridge, Mrs. Butterworth's syrup, and the Eskimo pie ice cream brand are also considering renaming or retiring their products. National Football League Commissioner Roger Goodell acknowledged that the NFL had made mistakes by not listening to players who complained about racism. The Washington Redskins removed founder and avowed segregationist George Preston Marshall from all official team material, as well as deleting his name from the stadium's Ring of Fame. And NASCAR vowed to do better in addressing racial injustice. People are speaking out about the everyday racism and discrimination they are faced. And many people are beginning to understand white privilege and the many ways they have participated in the continuation of systemic racism. Unfortunately, this past weekend in Kenosha, 2 Wisconsin police officers were put on leave last Monday as state authorities investigate why Jacob Blake, a 29-year-old black man, was shot multiple times in the back as he entered the driver's side of an SUV. Jacob Blake was shot in front of his 3 children, ages 3, 5, and 8, who were in the car. Blake may never walk again. There is still so much more to do, but may we continue to hear God's call. As we look around, we may never see an actual burning bush, but we might take some time to listen and wonder about God's call in our own lives. If we seek God's presence, we might find ourselves participating in a call much larger than we could ever think possible. The healing of creation, the healing of God's children, becoming an agent of justice. And like Moses, we may at first feel we aren't enough, or we might spend some time debating, why me? Why was I called? From Sermon Seeds, Catherine Matthews writes, our culture tells us that we should be independent and self-sufficient. We just have to make it on our own. But Walter Brueggemann thinks we are only fooling ourselves. For like Moses, we are not autonomous. There is the one who knows us and calls us by name, even while we imagine we are unknown and unsummoned. So the question will be, do we have the courage to listen and respond, trusting that wherever we are called to go or whoever we are called to be, we can be absolutely sure we will never be alone. God will always be with us. And for a moment, if you would, let's imagine Moses coming down from that mountain, from that place of mystery, from that holy ground, soaked in grace, never alone, and never again the same. May our lives never be the same as well. Amen.